First on BBC Two, writer Alan Bennett's sights are firmly set on his favourite building, the County Arcade in Leeds.
When in my early 20s I first went to Italy, to Venice and Florence, I couldn't at first understand why it all seemed so familiar. I knew these buildings. I knew them because I'd been brought up in Leeds, where so many of the banks and commercial premises were modelled on, reproduced even, the palaces and baptistries, and as here, the bell towers of Renaissance Italy. When in the 60s, Leeds, like most northern cities, was sacked by property developers, many of these 19th century buildings were demolished, and those that remained were washed. You can always tell when some act of architectural murder has been committed, because the surviving witnesses to it are washed in dubious expiation. Lady Macbeth was probably an architect. Among the happier, even frivolous survivors, though, are the arcades. County Arcade was always the poshest, but never quite so posh as it looks today, and it's been handsomely restored. There's always something festive about County Arcade, something exuberant and theatrical. And it wasn't until I was asked to do this programme that I found out why. This arcade is one of the few, as it were, lay buildings by an architect who was known for his design for innumerable Victorian and Edwardian theatres, Frank Matcham. The arcade does have a connection with the theatre in that it was part of a scheme designed by Matcham to link up with his Empire Theatre, Lower Down Brigade. I remember the Empire when I was a boy, because it used to advertise some of its stalls as fauteuil, a word I found both mysterious and unpronounceable. I was told it meant armchairs, and on the one occasion I went to the Empire, I was bitterly disappointed to find they weren't the kind of armchairs that were part of our three-piece suite. The Empire is long gone. But here's the County Arcade, which somehow to me almost smacks of the seaside. I think it's the material, glazed brick, made at Bermontoft's outside Leeds, which is also the stuff of the grander hotels and boarding houses on the front at Morecambe and Cleveland. As a child, I was in this arcade more often than most, and I don't apologise for the fact the charm of it now has as much to do with memory as with architecture. I can remember many of the shops, in particular a toy shop that was here. At the start of the Second War, toys were in short supply, and my dad, who was a butcher with a co-op, had invested in a fret saw and started making toy animals. His speciality were penguins, which he mounted on little green four-wheeled carts. And on his afternoon off, he'd hawk these round the toy shops of Leeds, though without much success. Then one afternoon he came to a toy shop here called Smart's, run by Mr. Baildon. Old Baildon, Dad always called him. And he offered to take Dad's entire output, though at a much reduced rate. So every week after that, my mum and Dad, and sometimes my brother and me, would come down with carrier bags with the week's output of penguins and the occasional giraffe. They seemed to my brother and me a very dull toy, but if we ever saw a child trailing one behind it, we'd hang about, hoping to overhear an expression of pleasure. My dad, presumably experiencing the same frisson as an author does when he catches someone reading one of his books. There are some surprising survivals. There was a corsetier here in the 40s, and the same firm of corsetiers is here now. It's a curious trade, and not one I associate with the present day. Though, of course, corsetiers seldom had premises. It tended to be a profession taken up by single ladies of a certain age who'd go round and do fittings in the home. My Aunt Evelyn was a corsetier. An ample lady, like many of them, she was a model for the product she was marketing. This used to be the Mecca ballroom, which imparted a degree of whoopee to the arcade. It was thought, by me at any rate, to be a place of great wickedness. The boys in my class at school would sometimes go dancing there and come back swearing that they'd seen a prostitute, the cast iron proof, a chain worn round the ankle. And here was Cashdisha, the gents' outfitters, where we used to get our school blazers, but didn't used to get those great class indicators, Cash's name tapes, which better class boys had sewn in all their clothes, all of which will irritate you a great deal if you're just wanting to hear me talk about the architecture. Happy though I am to see this place so splendidly restored, if I'm honest, it's a bit too smart, too done up for me. And these painted leaves make it look like Christmas all the year round. Still, that's a small price to pay to keep it from the bulldozer. Oh, that the financial institutions which rule our lives and which have paid for this restoration had learnt their lesson 10 years earlier, in which case England would be a better place to live in. As it is, I'd like to come back here in 20 or 30 years' time, and it'll all seem a bit less synthetic. Time will have weathered these slightly too twee shop fronts and faded the gilt a bit, and maybe one or two of those seedier establishments will have begun to creep back. A herbalist, perhaps, or a second-hand bookshop. Shops selling what people really want, rather than what they can be persuaded to want. Nowadays we live to shop. It's the only thing that holds us together. As the late Blessed Margaret said, there's no such thing as society, only shoppers. If we can't shop, we get depressed or feel oppressed. The deliverance of Eastern Europe, not so much the restoration of freedom as the restoration of freedom to shop. There are small specialised shops selling chocolates, shops selling potpourri and scented candles, card shops with messages for every conceivable occasion, grave and gay and straight, kitchen shops, shops selling jams in esoteric combinations, rhubarb and ginger, almond and apricot, out-of-the-way mustards, pedigree vinegars. Lovely, lovely shopping.